In January 2022, a new documentary reopened one of America's most disturbing criminal cases, pulling viewers back into decades of fear, unanswered questions, and chilling silence. The film revisited the life and crimes of Dennis Rader, better known as the Btk Killer, an acronym he coined himself, standing for bind, torture, kill. For years, his name had faded from headlines, but not from memory. Wichita, Kansas, still carried the weight of what he had done. Beginning in the mid-1970s, BTK terrorized the city with brutal murders and taunting letters, then vanished without explanation. The documentary did not merely recount crimes. It explored how an ordinary-looking man maintained a double life for decades while law enforcement struggled to catch a killer who seemed to enjoy the game as much as the violence itself. Wichita in the 1970s was a growing Midwestern city defined by quiet neighborhoods, strong church communities, and a sense of safety rooted in familiarity. People knew their neighbors. Doors were often left unlocked. Children rode bicycles until dusk without fear. That sense of normalcy would soon be shattered. In January 1974, the Otero family was found murdered inside their home in a crime so brutal it defied comprehension. 4 lives were taken, including 2 children. There was no clear suspect, no obvious motive, and no immediate explanation. The crime scene suggested control, planning, and cruelty beyond impulse. Detectives sensed immediately that this was not a random act. Yet despite their instincts, they had no name, no face, and no trail to follow. Wichita had just encountered a predator hiding in plain sight. In the months following the Otero murders, fear spread quietly rather than explosively. Parents became cautious, routines changed, and conversations shifted toward safety. Then, nearly a year later, local media received a letter that transformed fear into terror. The author described the murders in disturbing detail, details only the killer could know. He claimed responsibility and announced a name for himself, BTK. The letter was not just a confession, it was a declaration. He wanted recognition. He wanted control. He wanted to be remembered. For investigators, the letter confirmed their worst fears. They were dealing with a serial killer who craved attention and felt untouchable. The case took on new urgency, but also new complexity. BTK was not hiding. He was watching. Over the next several years, more murders followed. Each crime carried the same signature elements: binding, control, prolonged terror. Victims were stalked, chosen carefully, and attacked in places that should have been safe. BTK did not act in a frenzy. He planned. He took trophies. He documented his crimes. Yet between murders, he lived an ordinary life. He held jobs, attended church, and blended seamlessly into the community he was terrorizing. This duality became one of the most haunting aspects of the case. How could someone capable of such cruelty also appear so normal? The documentary emphasized this contrast, forcing viewers to confront an uncomfortable truth. Monsters do not always look like monsters. As the years passed, law enforcement faced mounting pressure. Advances in forensic science were still limited, and profiling was in its early stages. Investigators worked tirelessly, reviewing evidence, chasing tips, and following leads that often went nowhere. BTK's letters complicated matters further. He mocked police, corrected media reports, and criticized investigators for failing to understand his brilliance. Each communication reignited fear across Wichita. People who had begun to relax were pulled back into anxiety. The killer was still out there, and he wanted everyone to know it. The case became a psychological war, one in which BTK often seemed to be winning. Then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, BTK went silent. After a final murder in 1991, the letters stopped. No more taunts. No more clues. No explanation. For more than a decade, the case grew cold. New generations of detectives inherited old files. Some residents assumed the killer had died or moved away. Others feared he was still watching, waiting. The families of the victims were left in limbo, without closure or justice. The documentary captured this period as one of unresolved tension, a silence that was not peaceful, but heavy. BTK had vanished, but his shadow remained. Behind that silence, life went on for the man responsible. He married, raised children, advanced in his career, and became involved in his church. To those around him, he was a dependable family man and community member. This reality disturbed investigators deeply when it later came to light. It challenged assumptions about evil and accountability. The idea that someone could commit horrific crimes and then return home to a normal life unsettled not just Wichita, but the entire nation. The The documentary explored how this double life was not accidental, it was deliberate. BTK compartmentalized his actions, convincing himself he was in control of both worlds. By the early 2000s, cold cases across the country were being re-examined using new technology. DNA analysis, improved databases, and renewed public interest offered fresh hope. In Wichita, investigators decided to bring BTK back into the light. They reopened communication through the media, appealing directly to the killer's ego. It was a calculated risk. They believed BTK's need for recognition might draw him out. For years, he had defined himself through attention. The silence may have frustrated him more than investigators realized. The gamble worked. In 2004, nearly 13 years after his last known murder, BTK resurfaced. He sent letters, packages, and cryptic messages to local media and police. He referenced past crimes and hinted at new information. But something had changed. He was older. Technology had advanced. The control he once held was slipping. One communication included a floppy disk, a seemingly harmless mistake that would ultimately unravel his carefully constructed anonymity. Investigators traced metadata on the disk back to a church computer, then to a name that shocked everyone. The arrest in February 2005 sent shockwaves through Wichita and far beyond. When authorities revealed the suspect, disbelief spread quickly. The man taken into custody did not resemble the monster many had imagined. He was calm, methodical, and almost unsettlingly ordinary. Neighbors described him as polite and dependable. Co-workers struggled to reconcile his quiet demeanor with the crimes now attached to his name. During police questioning, he did not deny responsibility. Instead, he confessed. In court, he recounted his actions in precise, unemotional detail, describing years of planning, surveillance, and execution with disturbing clarity. There was no dramatic outburst, no visible remorse. For the families of the victims, the courtroom became a place of renewed trauma. They were forced to listen as the man responsible for decades of fear spoke as if narrating a routine task. The documentary emphasized this moment not for shock value, but to show the profound disconnect between the killer's self-perception and the devastation he caused. Sentencing brought a legal conclusion, but not emotional closure. The court imposed multiple life sentences, ensuring the killer would never walk free again. For some families, the verdict provided a sense of relief, a confirmation that the threat was finally gone. For others, it changed very little. Years of grief, unanswered questions, and irreversible loss could not be undone by a prison sentence. The documentary carefully explored this divide, showing how justice is not a single moment, but a complicated process that affects each survivor differently. Some found strength in seeing accountability enforced. Others felt hollow, knowing no punishment could truly balance what was taken. The courtroom scenes underscored a hard truth. The legal system can end a case, but it cannot restore what violence destroys. The scars left by BTK's crimes would remain long after the trial concluded. The January 2022 documentary approached the case with restraint, choosing analysis over sensationalism. Rather than centering the killer's notoriety, it examined how systemic gaps, human assumptions, and evolving technology shaped the investigation. It asked difficult questions about why warning signs were missed and how long-term cases can slip into stagnation. Investigators reflected on their early limitations, acknowledging how few tools were available in the 1970s compared to today. The film also highlighted the persistence required to reopen cold cases, how patience, humility, and adaptability often matter as much as intelligence. By revisiting the investigation step by step, the documentary reframed the story as one of institutional learning rather than failure alone. It emphasized that progress in criminal justice often comes at a high cost, paid in years and in lives. One of the documentary's most unsettling conclusions focused on motive. These crimes were not driven solely by rage or impulse, but by a desire for domination. Control was central, not just over victims, but over the narrative itself. The killer sought power through fear, recognition, and manipulation. Letters were carefully crafted to maintain relevance. Silence was used strategically. Understanding this psychology became key to understanding both the longevity of the crimes and their eventual resolution. Investigators realized too late that attention fueled the offender's sense of superiority. When that need was exploited rather than ignored, it became the turning point. The documentary framed this as a lesson in behavioral analysis, understanding why a criminal acts can be just as important as knowing how. Media coverage played a complicated role throughout the case. On one hand, public awareness kept pressure on law enforcement and ensured the victims were not forgotten. On the other, coverage sometimes amplified the very notoriety the killer desired. Headlines, televised updates, and repeated use of the BTK name reinforced the identity he had created for himself. The documentary did not assign blame, but it examined the unintended consequences of exposure. It raised ethical questions that remain relevant today. How do you inform the public without empowering those who seek attention through violence? Where does responsibility lie when storytelling intersects with trauma? These questions were left intentionally unresolved, encouraging viewers to reflect rather than accept easy conclusions. For Wichita, the aftermath extended far beyond the courtroom. Neighborhoods once associated with comfort and familiarity were permanently altered. Some residents moved away. Others remained, carrying quiet vigilance into daily life. Community trust had been shaken, but not destroyed. The documentary highlighted moments of solidarity, vigils, memorials, and collective efforts to support affected families. These acts did not erase fear, but they rebuilt connection. Wichita's story became one of resilience shaped by loss. The city refused to let its identity be reduced to a single criminal case, even one as notorious as BTK. Instead, it chose remembrance paired with resolve. Re-examining the case decades later revealed how assumptions can obscure danger. The belief that evil is obvious, that threats look threatening, proved deeply flawed. The documentary emphasized how normalcy can act as camouflage, allowing harmful individuals to operate undetected. This realization extended beyond one case, offering a broader warning about complacency. It challenged viewers to reconsider how society defines risk, trust, and accountability. The film argued that vigilance does not require paranoia, but awareness, and understanding that appearances alone are not safeguards. In this way, the BTK case became a lesson not just for law enforcement, but for communities everywhere. The legacy of the case continues to influence modern investigations. Advances in forensic science, data tracking, and behavioral profiling were shaped in part by lessons learned from long-running cases like this one. The documentary showed how failures became frameworks for improvement. Communication strategies evolved. Evidence preservation standards changed. Cold cases gained renewed importance. What once seemed unsolvable is now approached with cautious optimism. The story demonstrated that progress often comes incrementally, built on the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths about past limitations. As the documentary neared its conclusion, it deliberately shifted focus away from the perpetrator. Attention returned to the victims, their lives before the crimes, their relationships, their absence. This reframing served as a reminder that true crime is not about fascination with violence, but acknowledgement of loss. By centering the victims, the film resisted glorification and restored humanity to a story often overshadowed by infamy. Names, memories, and personal histories replaced statistics and headlines. Ultimately, the BTK story became one about time. Time lost to fear. Time stolen from victims. Time required for truth to surface. The documentary treated time as both an enemy and an ally, allowing crimes to continue, but also enabling reflection, technological growth, and eventual accountability. Justice delayed, it argued, is not justice denied if persistence remains. But delay always carries a cost. That cost was borne by families who waited decades for answers. The January 2022 documentary closed with a sobering message. Evil does not always announce itself. It can exist quietly, patiently, and unnoticed. The most dangerous threats are often those embedded within routine and familiarity. By stripping away myth and exposing reality, the film reframed the BTK case not as a legend, but as a warning, one that insists vigilance, empathy, and accountability must never fade into silence. The documentary also explored how fear reshapes behavior long after immediate danger has passed. In Wichita, habits formed during the years of uncertainty lingered quietly. Some residents still double-checked locks out of instinct. Others recalled how ordinary sounds once carried menace, how shadows felt heavier, and how trust had been recalibrated. These psychological after-effects were not visible in police files, but they were real and enduring. The film emphasized that serial crimes do not end when the offender is caught. They echo through communities in subtle ways. Fear alters how people see one another, how freely they move, and how safe they feel in familiar spaces. By including voices from the community, the documentary illustrated that healing is gradual and uneven. Closure is not a switch that flips on arrest day. It is a long process shaped by memory, reassurance, and time. Another focus of the documentary was accountability beyond the individual offender. It examined institutional responsibility, questioning how systems can fail even when individuals act with dedication. Investigators acknowledged missteps without defensiveness, recognizing that hindsight exposes gaps invisible in real time. The film presented this not as condemnation, but as necessary reflection. Progress in criminal justice often emerges from honest reassessment rather than denial. Procedures evolve because past cases demand improvement. The BTK investigation, stretched across decades, became an example of how long-term cases require continuity, documentation, and adaptability. When personnel change and time passes, critical information can fragment. The documentary highlighted how modern protocols now emphasize preservation and collaboration to prevent such losses. These lessons, learned painfully, continue to shape how unresolved cases are handled today. The role of technology received particular attention as well. Tools that were unimaginable in the 1970s became decisive decades later. Digital metadata, data storage, and forensic advancements transformed investigative possibilities. The documentary carefully avoided framing technology as a cure-all, instead showing it as a force multiplier when combined with strategy and patience. Technology alone does not solve crimes, people do. However, when used wisely, it can reveal truths once hidden behind anonymity and time. The BTK case demonstrated how even a small technological oversight could dismantle years of careful concealment. This moment underscored a larger point. Criminals adapt, but systems evolve faster when informed by experience. The film positioned technological progress as both a hope and a responsibility. Equally important was the examination of memory, how it fades, distorts, and resurfaces. Witnesses from the early years struggled to recall details with precision decades later. Investigators faced the challenge of reconstructing events from incomplete recollections and aging evidence. The documentary treated memory not as a weakness, but as a fragile human element within justice. It showed how collective memory can preserve awareness even when individual details blur. Communities remember patterns, fear, and loss even when names and dates become unclear. This collective memory played a role in keeping the case alive, ensuring it was never fully forgotten. The story illustrated that remembrance itself can be an act of resistance against silence. The families of the victims remained central throughout the film's final act. Their testimonies carried weight not because of emotion alone, but because of endurance. Decades passed, yet grief did not diminish, it changed. The documentary showed how loss reshapes identity, how anniversaries become markers of absence, and how unanswered questions linger even after convictions. Some families chose privacy. Others spoke publicly, hoping their voices would prevent future harm. The film respected both choices, emphasizing that there is no single correct way to survive trauma. By allowing families to define their own narratives, the documentary reinforced that victims are not footnotes in criminal history. They are the reason justice matters. The documentary also addressed the danger of mythologizing offenders. Over time, repeated retellings can distort reality, transforming crimes into stories stripped of consequence. The film actively resisted this by grounding every revelation in impact rather than spectacle. It challenged viewers to reconsider why such cases attract attention and what responsibility audiences carry when consuming them. Fascination, the documentary suggested, must never outweigh empathy. True understanding requires confronting discomfort rather than indulging curiosity. By dismantling the mystique surrounding the BTK persona, the film reframed the offender as neither genius nor legend, but as a human being responsible for deliberate harm. From a broader perspective, the case became a lens through which to examine prevention. The documentary asked how communities can recognize warning signs without succumbing to suspicion or fear. It emphasized education, communication, and support systems as safeguards. Isolation, secrecy, and unchecked power were recurring themes. While no system can eliminate risk entirely, awareness can reduce vulnerability. The film suggested that prevention is not solely a law enforcement task, but a shared responsibility involving institutions, families, and communities. This message extended the documentary's relevance beyond a single case, transforming it into a broader conversation about safety and vigilance. As the narrative approached its conclusion, the documentary reflected on justice as a concept rather than an outcome. Justice was shown as imperfect, delayed, and incomplete, yet still essential. The film acknowledged that some wounds never fully heal and that accountability does not equal restoration. However, it argued that truth matters. Naming wrongdoing matters. Recognition matters. These elements do not undo harm, but they affirm value. By confronting the past honestly, societies reinforce boundaries against future violence. The Btk case illustrated that even when justice arrives late, it still carries meaning for those who waited. The documentary's final reflections returned once more to time. Time allowed the crimes to continue, but it also enabled perspective. Distance revealed patterns once obscured by chaos. Time gave investigators new tools and families new language to describe their pain. The film suggested that while time cannot heal all wounds, it can create space for understanding. The long arc of the Btk case demonstrated that persistence, even when progress seems impossible, can eventually lead to answers. This message resonated as both cautionary and hopeful. In closing, the January 2022 documentary left viewers with a restrained but powerful conclusion. The story it told was not one of fascination with evil, but of accountability, memory, and vigilance. It reminded audiences that danger does not always announce itself and that trust must be balanced with awareness. By centering victims, examining systems, and rejecting myth, the film transformed a notorious case into a lesson with lasting relevance. The silence that once protected a killer was replaced by truth, not as spectacle, but as responsibility. And in that truth, the documentary found its purpose.